Welcome back to another episode of Us Anxious Folk. I have a very special guest with me today, someone that we haven't had on the podcast before. We have the licensed psychotherapist Duygu Balan. She is an author. She's written two beautiful books. The second one being called Confidently Chill, which is an anxiety workbook. It is very comprehensive, so I was just congratulating her on being able to write a book while being a parent. Duygu, thank you for being here. I'm very happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thank
Yeah,
you for having me.
yeah, no problem. So one of the things I find really interesting about you that you have this amazing background in dance and yoga and art, and I really love how that has sort of related to how you know, express yourself. How have you found that in your life?
From a very young age, I've always been involved in creative expression, I think. And it was always encouraged in my family as well. So I was always interested in writing stories, and I was always interested in drama. And
Mhm.
I was in theater for a while. I danced for a long time. And I think it helped with my personal growth and my personal journey. I moved around a lot. I had to adapt to different cultures growing up. And I think having, especially when I had language barriers because I moved to countries that I didn't speak the language, I think having that kind of access to my own body and creativity was definitely an important outlet. And as I was working in trauma, and specializing in trauma, I was realizing oftentimes how words actually weren't enough, they weren't sufficient. And with movement or creative expression, we could actually go so much deeper than talk therapy, that we could access parts of ourselves that maybe weren't accessible to us with language. So I thought that's why I started to dive even deeper into it, and also incorporating a lot of those practices in my work as a therapist.
That's amazing. And so you've found that creativity is sort of a doorway for healing, is that right?
Definitely, it is definitely there's no judgments when we're in a creative state. And there's also, we allow for free association and for flow so much more than we are allowed in any other social or verbal interaction. There are really not that many rules around it. And there's really also not a clear definition of what success is with the creative process. And that's why there's a lot more freedom, and there's a lot more getting in tune with our inner landscapes, which is so valuable. And in many other aspects of our lives, there's so many social constructs, there's so many rules, there's so many filters applied. And I think that in the creative world, there is so much more depth, and that is actually what allows us to really connect with ourselves.
Mm. Yeah. Oh, I love that. I got chills while you were saying that. It makes me think of that you know how people talk about the dark night of the soul, and it feels like creativity is a safe way to explore those sort of shadow parts of yourself.
Yes,
Why do you think that
definitely.
creativity is maybe not often overlooked, but why is it sometimes overlooked in, sort of the first approach to healing?
Um, I think it's changing, thankfully. I think it's actually, I see a lot more of it incorporated in education system, incorporated in the healing system. Somatic approaches and creative expression has been much more incorporated than it was before. I guess one of the reasons why is there we're in a culture where everything needs to happen quick, right?
Mhm.
Like we want quick solutions to our problems, we want quick fixes, and diving really deep into our psyche, of course, is not very quick. So I think that is probably one of the reasons in the medical system, in the mental health system. The approaches are can be inclined to a lot more behavior targeted behavior,
Mm.
targeting behaviors. And that might be not that easy to do with creative expression because creative expression definitely is something that evolves and unfolds through time.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons. Another reason is there's still some stigma and ignorance around mental health struggles and what it actually really means and how we all have certain traits, right? We all have inherently certain traits of anxiety and depression. It's actually, these are all very human things, but because there's so much stigma around it, it just doesn't get that much, I think, airtime in general still. So
Mm.
even though it's changing, I still think that there's some stigma around it. And maybe that's why there's also some ignorance that it's actually all these things that we're talking about, anxiety, depression, existential questioning, all of that is actually just a part of the human condition. And the creative expression of it is also a part of the human condition.
Yeah. Yeah. And moving into anxiety, you spoke about in the beginning of Confidently Chill, your new book, about the fact that we are in that state of anxiety crisis. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it's gotten so overwhelming and so widely diagnosed?
Well, the world that we live in, right? If we look into the world that we live in, there's so much unrest, there's
Mm.
so much conflict, there's so much economic instability, and it's just sociopolitical, so much stressors right now. And I think it's just inevitable not to have anxiety right now, like right? Like if we like with the environment and everything that's happening, it's just and there's also like the reality of there is real problems and real anxiety provoking situations, and I think it affects many people. That's one reason, and then the other reason is of course social media. I think social media actually, especially among young people, creates a lot of anxiety because one, there is a lot of information available, but the information isn't necessarily rooted. So, for
Mm.
instance, there's a lot of information available of what's happening in the world and the environment, or there's a lot of information about mental health struggles, but without actually having enough grounds, like without it actually like in tidbits. So
Yeah.
that actually can be very anxiety provoking. People actually do a lot of self-diagnosis because of this, and also the fear of missing out. People really curate their lives in social media, so we might think that other people have these amazing lives while we are struggling, and that definitely contributes to the anxiety of young people. It also pushes people towards more isolation. And and we are also all still, I think, as globally in a kind of post-traumatic state from COVID still. I mean, I
Mm.
think the recovery from COVID still has a long way to go. There's still a lot of people who have had many losses, job losses, loved ones, and they didn't really have enough time or space to grieve. It
Mm.
was just this constant being on survival mode. And I think that definitely contributes to anxiety for many people.
Mm. Yeah, it was kind of like the rug got pulled out. Like we were used to the world being a certain way, and then it just flipped, and it was really unsettling. I still feel
Yes,
like now I know how think quickly things can change.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, that's what trauma is, exactly what it is. It's the idea that everything that is applicable for today and everything that we know today might not be applicable tomorrow. So when we're in a non-trauma state, we always kind of rely on how things were yesterday and the tools that we used yesterday. Even if things weren't amazing or great, the tools that we had yesterday, we always kind of had that fallback that they will work tomorrow as well. But trauma in the pandemic actually really shifted and shattered that idea, where all of a sudden the things that we relied on weren't accessible for us anymore. And people are still having that effect and struggling with that effect, and especially young people, because for young people, the right around the time the identity formation was happening, when socialization was happening, they actually are still recovering from that, from having even the social skills. I mean, kids were out of school for such a long period of time in a very crucial time when socialization happens. And
Mm,
that, of course, there's still effects of it, not just socially, but also in education wise, psychologically. There's a lot of impact that still needs to be dealt with.
mm. I've never heard that definition of trauma, and that was really, really interesting. What do you think our like focus should be on returning to that state of wholeness that maybe we didn't so much have before COVID, but was certainly shaken during the pandemic?
I think, these kind of conversations are definitely one way, raising awareness to it. I think mental health and mental health struggles and bringing community awareness will lead to systemic changes. And there's definitely need to be obviously changes in policy level in the mental health and system and education system and such. But that will only happen if there are more and more conversations about it.
Mhm.
And then also, I think one thing that I actually the pandemic did, which is in some ways positive, is it made a lot of things accessible online that weren't online accessible before. So
Yeah.
there are, for instance, I work with many patients who actually found a lot of groups. So, for instance, if you live in a smaller area and there are really not groups for specific things, for instance, people for Turkish, right? Like I'm Turkish and there are limited Turkish communities in right in smaller places, but because now that it's online, people can actually talk to people who are from the same country or who have had similar struggles, like people who may have lost someone to suicide, and these kind of groups, I think, are also very healing, and
Mm.
because it was trauma and anxiety, or depression, one of the biggest thing is that the idea, even if it's not necessarily true, the idea and the narrative is I'm alone,
Mm.
and I'm suffering alone, and no one wants to see me suffer, no one wants to hear about it, and that isolation actually really amplifies the symptoms. And when we have access to other people who are actually also are suffering through the same thing, and we are able to give them support and accept their support, that actually really shifts the loneliness and creates a sense of community, which is the number one condition for healing, because we heal in connection to another person or other people.
Yeah, I've certainly found that in my own life. I tried to sort of recover from agoraphobia for so long, but when I started talking openly about it online and found other people who were going through the same thing, I kind of catapulted towards being able to face my fear because I felt like I was facing it with people who were also doing the same thing rather than just
Yeah.
by myself. Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah, community is beautiful. Um, I want to shift to the body because, as you said before, that the body is such a great way to access healing, and you have that whole background in dance and theatre, which is very body based. How can we learn to work with our body compassionately? Because I think when it comes to anxiety and people who deal with panic disorder in particular, the body is not a safe place to go. And there's that need to override the sensations and to kind of ignore what the body is trying to tell you because it's alarming and it's scary. So how do we get to the place of leaning into the body compassionately without trying to override or overcome the sensations?
hmm Well, one thing I think is about the nervous system, like thinking about the body from a nervous system perspective, actually is very helpful because our body reactions, we're reacting to an anxiety, we're reacting to a panic, and at times, when we call it anxiety, it's things that are not even necessarily, we're not in danger in that moment, right? Like we're talking, because we're not really talking about anxiety when we're actually in danger because
Mm.
then right, like if you're being chased, then of course you're going to feel really anxious, and
Yeah.
that's actually you're going to disconnect from everything else in your body, and your whole idea is going to be survive, and that is actually very appropriate. So we're
Mm.
talking about when the danger is, when the feeling is much more than the situation, right? It's
Yeah.
disproportionate to what's happening in our environment. So when we approach it from a nervous system level, when we're writing, as you said, the kind of shortness of breath or that panicky feeling, our body is telling us something, but we're reacting to something that is not necessarily warranting that kind of reaction. So when we first uh, focus on the body level and uh, kind of trick our bodies actually, because we are not going to start breathing deeply if we're in danger. That's just not in our nature. So
Mm.
if we are focusing on our breath and we're starting to slow down and breathe deeply and ground ourselves to the environment we're in, our body is going to start believing and seeing that we're safe.
Mm.
So once we can do that, once we can and at first it's not going to feel organic and it might feel a little forced and that's okay. But as we do it more and more, as we learn how to regulate our breaths, our heart rate is going to match our breath, everything is going to slow down. Then actually we can start thinking about more structured or more mindful or more awareness-based exercises to begin with regulating the nervous system
Mm.
and telling our body that we're safe first.
Yeah. Okay. So it is sort of that redirect of not getting taken away by what the body is doing because it's not necessarily, as you said, it's disproportionate to the current environment. So it's sort of like I get the image that like your body is a small child that you need to kind of help to regulate in that moment.
Yes.
Mm.
Definitely. And actually, that's kind of it's very accurate because we teach our children how to do that, right? We teach our children when they're younger, we teach them how to, first of all, name their emotions. Like if they don't want to leave the playground, we might
Mm.
say, are you feeling frustrated right now? And giving them the name. And we teach them how to express it in a more constructive way. And we teach them how to negotiate their desires. And that's kind of the same way. So once we are on our own, we parent ourselves because that is kind of like the reaction, as you said, it's like it's a very primal reaction.
Mm.
So we teach our body that right now you're here, this is the room you're in, you're sitting on this chair, you're safe right now.
Mm.
Um, and we start believing it when we are matching our breaths to it, and then we are obviously this is when if we're actually safe. Like if we're being attacked, we're not going to believe it, and we shouldn't. But if we're safe, and then we tell ourselves kind of like a mantra, you're safe right now, you're in your home right now, you have control right now, you're an adult right now, these kind of things, if
Mm.
especially if we're dealing with childhood trauma or doing some sort of inner child, our inner child is acting up and our inner child is feeling unsafe and triggered by a traumatic incident that may have happened, then we start believing that we're safe. And once we believe that we're safe, then we can actually do deeper exploration and find patterns and come up with solutions and think about the situation in much more rational ways.
Mhm. Mm. Yeah. I wonder if that's why in my experience I found writing in particular to be so helpful because maybe I let those child emotions out with the words and then I'm able to also look at it from my adult perspective potentially. I don't
Yeah.
know. Um, so how can we then relearn safety in a body that has been through trauma or panic? So I hear you saying starting with the breath and starting to match the breath with the body, but how can we, I guess, really get to that place of feeling safe in our body?
I think that's a very good question. So one thing is the more that we have that experience, the more automatic it will become.
Mm.
So the more that we have experiences of feeling safe, or the more that we have experiences where we were able to regulate our anxiety, or, we got anxious about something, but then it turned out fine. The more that we have these kind of experiences, the power of it would be a lot less. And especially when we're talking about trauma, there will be, I always tell people that I'm working with, there will be moments that we're triggered. There
Mm.
will, and the goal is not never to be triggered.
Mm.
I don't think, because I don't think that's realistic. There will be moments of being triggered, but I think it's the conversation is that we will be able to notice the triggers, catch it on time, and have coping skills. And when we know, like, instead of actually running with the triggers and getting all dysregulated, we will have the ability to say, I'm being triggered right now. And that recognition, that awareness is actually a game changes everything. Because once we're able to say that, then we're not really, it's not this irrational, this like unknown panic. We
Yeah.
know what's happening. We can say, okay, I'm being triggered right now. And then what works? In the past, what kind of things did we try when in moments like this that helped us? Maybe we can call a safe person. Or maybe we can go out and, take a walk or listen to a song that helps us calm down. But we will definitely have more tools if we're able to name the trigger and if we're able to have awareness that we're actually in a triggered zone.
Yeah. Okay. Because I guess we're creating less tension then if we're not acting like it's some unknown thing that we have to fight?
Yes, definitely. For instance, some people actually they don't even know that they're triggered. I worked with many people who have these very subtle triggers. For instance, it could be even a song. So while an event was happening, a very stressful event, there might be a song in the background. They never really identified it. And
Right.
then whenever that song comes or something similar to that song, they feel very dysregulated and they don't even know why. So having mindful exercises, especially things like meditation or, as you mentioned, writing, will help us to discover these triggers. And then, even if we don't really have a story, because it's not really about the story, we don't really have to have exactly know what happened, because memory, sometimes we don't have access to the memory either because we repressed it or because we were too young to make verbal memories. But that sensation of what that song evokes,
Mm.
and bringing awareness to that and allowing for those feelings to flow through, and saying, okay, so I'm having this experience with this song, but right now I'm safe, and right now I can deep breathely, and now and not right now I can relax into, this environment that I'm in, this chair that I'm sitting. I can call my friend. These kind of things will actually make it so that that song loses the power of triggering. So even if you hear that song, you might say, "Oh, this is a triggering song for me," but you might not just get so dysregulated because you already know what that song does, and you know that actually you're not unsafe, and that
Mm.
song actually doesn't have true power over you.
Mm. I really like the way that you noted that you don't necessarily need the story. Um, I think sometimes we really look for that and we want to have that because we feel like it's gonna be the gateway that like unlocks the trauma. But my therapist always says to me, you don't need to intellectualize everything because I'm always trying to figure out like why did that happen? Why did this? And she's like, you don't really need to know that sometimes. You just need to like feel it.
Yeah, that's definitely true. Definitely I agree with that. The story can help us.
Mm.
Sometimes it can help us kind of like create a map, and
Mm.
it can help us feel certain feelings, right? Like this. But in trauma, actually, it's very interesting. Like when you work in trauma, you see that some people have the story, but they don't have any emotions attached to the story. So it's almost like a cover story. So they're telling you
Right.
what happened to them as if they're telling you what happened to somebody else. So
Yeah.
that story, actually, in that case, is not really helpful because we don't really need what exactly happened. We need to be able to access the emotions that we weren't able to feel in that moment. In a traumatic moment or childhood trauma, which is usually a series of traumatic moments in
Mm,
series of traumatic events, you're not really going to be able to feel your trauma because it's not conducive of survival. You're not going to be able to feel pain or scared or depressed or any of that. You're just going to have to either dissociate and numb your feelings, or you're going to normalize them, especially if you're a young child, because your survival depends on, if it's familial abuse, depends on the caregivers. So, for instance, if you're telling the story as a cover story and there's really no access to the emotions that weren't that they also weren't accessible at the time, then we're not really working with the trauma.
mm,
But even if we don't have the story, but we're having the emotions, we're able to have the pain, go down to the pain and go down to the discomfort and the sadness and the helplessness, then we're actually working. Then you're actually working with trauma.
hmm. And so, how would you get to that place if you're somebody who's just dealing with the story and you're not able to touch the emotions because of how you weren't able to back then? How do you get there?
So I think that just as we were speaking, I think we get there through the body. We
Mm,
get there through moving our body, whether it's dancing or meditation or any other movement, yoga, or
mhm,
also creative expression is definitely. I work with many people who are in creative professions. I work with many actors and musicians. And these kind of arts actually really allow for that kind of access. So they might compose a song, and the song may not have a story, but
mm,
the song has the feelings that need to come out. And that it's
mhm,
all about it's kind of like draining the poison, right? Like we want that those emotions that were not able to be expressed through movement, through paint, through writing, anything. And one of the whatever the creative passion is, and it doesn't have to be, you don't have to have, work in a way that it's going to create masterpieces, but
mm,
it's just allowing for whatever it is that you're holding to flow in whatever way that you can. That I think is definitely changes many things and shifts a lot of things for people. I've seen it. I had the privilege to see this happen over and over again. And that is definitely a tremendous healing effect on
mm.
many.
That's beautiful. I love that. Tell me about emotional alchemy. What is emotional alchemy?
Emotional alchemy, I actually love that term. Emotional alchemy, to me, what it means is several things. One is it's a little bit connected to what we technically call EQ.
Mhm,
It's about the understanding of our inner worlds. It's about being able to understand our emotions. Many of us, because of the stressors that we live in, have learned to turn off our emotions because
mm,
that's what children do under stress. And then we carry that to adulthood. And I think emotional alchemy is the awareness of our own emotions. That's how it starts. Because once we're aware of our own emotions, then we actually can have more space for somebody else's emotions. And we can be more in tune with their emotions. We can read their cues, and there's a difference, right? Like reading somebody's cues and being open to somebody's emotions is very different than absorbing somebody else's emotions.
mm,
And it's a fine line that I think sometimes gets miscommunicated. So understanding and creating space and having emotional alchemy with someone does not mean that you absorb their pain or that you take the responsibility of their pain or
mm,
try to fix their pain, because we can't fix anybody else's pain, we can't do anybody else's work, but we can actually open our heart to somebody else's pain. And I think that is the emotional alchemy, and that is how we humans are wired, right? Like we are wired in a way where we really seek that
mm,
alchemy and that connection with other other people. And that's actually the only way we heal, which
Mm,
is why therapy works.
mhm,
Because in therapy, you're connecting to somebody else, and somebody else is opening their heart to you without really taking the responsibility of your pain, without absorbing it, but making space for it. And without judging you, and without, you know, holding you responsible or shaming you. It's just this open space, and that's what therapy is. And then we want to recreate that, of course, outside in our other relationships where we have that mutuality of it, where we are reciprocated, and we are able to give support and accept support of someone else.
mm. So even if we're like, even if we personally are going through something really difficult, um, would you say we still have the capacity to be able to offer that open space, but maybe just in like tiny micro doses with others who are going through a similar thing? Or are we
Yes,
sort of going to get trampled by, are we going to open ourselves too much, is what I'm asking.
are we opening will we open ourselves too much? I didn't understand the question.
I guess I'm thinking about how you said it can be mixed up with sort of taking on too much of somebody else's emotions. And I suppose when you're in that survival state, how do you kind of set those healthy boundaries where you're making an open space for somebody else's feelings and emotions, but you're not taking on all the responsibility of it?
Yeah, I think what I was in some ways referring to was in for instance in toxic dysfunctional relationships.
Yeah.
So because I work with many I guess younger generation, and there's a lot of relationship complexities that happen that are very correlated with attachment wounding and trauma. And there
Yeah.
are that idea of wanting to fix someone. I was in some ways
Mm,
referring to that,
yes.
and right. And so, of course, childhood trauma and attachment wounding has a lot of impact. And there's, of course, room for compassion
Mm,
when somebody, for instance, has a hard time trusting, or somebody has a hard time committing because of their history and because of their trauma. But that doesn't mean that the other person, is required to just allow for certain things to happen, or
right.
allow for ghosting, for instance, is a big one, right? Like
Hmm.
with avoidance and avoidant attachment, a lot of ghosting can happen. And it doesn't really, it's very hurtful and doesn't change that it hurts the other person. So if I feel like it just feeds into the cycle
Mm,
of trauma, if that is considered acceptable. So there's a difference in acknowledging, okay, so I understand that this is why it's happening, and I have
mm,
compassion for the reason. And also, this is very hurtful, and I really don't want to be treated this way. That's kind of what I mean, the difference of allowing for certain things to happen, or trying to take in someone's pain versus setting your own boundaries and advocating for yourself, as well as
mhm.
giving space to somebody's pain. We can talk about the pain, we can talk about the difficulty in committing, but I really don't like it when you don't reply to my texts. And
Yes, I know in my own life the line has become blurred a lot, and I think there's that tendency to people please, which makes it challenging to kind of set those boundaries. But certainly then having those healthy relationships has also been really healing, and learning about mutual respect and that sense of emotional alchemy as you spoke about. So I want to talk about human nature, because
Mhm.
you did mention that earlier, and I love one of my big things that I write about in my book is that we are humans, and like we keep trying to escape that in so many ways, but that's kind of where we get stuck. How can we return to our roots and remember that we are human beings, and like how can we learn to embody and visit with all of our emotions and our humanness?
Yeah, that's a very good point, and I like that you write about that. That's something that I'm thinking a lot about actually about the kind of spectrum of human being close to nature, that
Mm,
spectrum close to nature or close to machine,
mm,
right? Where we have that with technology now and how we're all kind of connected and everything is so there's such an underlying current of technology under everything right now and that idea of like is human closer to nature or is human closer to machine and
mm,
how like even with like the sterilization of the medical field or mental health field, it's actually something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Like, for instance, body fluids, right? We think of body fluids as disgusting and gross.
mm,
Tears, for instance, people don't want to show it. Tears are, for many cultures, for many people, especially men, still very shameful. People don't want to cry in public. And that to me is such an alarming thing because that is actually, human closer to machine. If you don't cry, and human closer to nature is if you are able to cry because crying is in some ways how we clear toxic waste, right?
mm,
It's a biological mechanism that we have, as is all the other body fluids.
mm,
And that is just something that I think about in the therapeutic setting too. For instance, the humanness of the therapist. That's definitely a stigma that I really am very much motivated to break. Like the therapy room, for instance, right? There's as therapist is required not to show personality. It's supposed to be sterile. At least that was the belief for so long. Even
mm,
the outfits of a therapist were kind of more pastel, flowy clothes. Not no not to, no tattoos, no piercings.
yeah.
It was very kind of sterile, and I think that's changing now. Now there's much more room for expression because a therapist is a human and
Mm,
the therapeutic process is somebody attaching to a human. Of course, it's professional and clinical, and it's not about the therapist, but still, it's one human connecting to another human.
mm,
So, um, I think one way of connecting to our humanness is through nature. It is through understanding that nature is so much bigger than us and
mm,
that we don't need to try to control it, and that there are just the waves of it, and focusing on even just textures that we're surrounded in, smells that we're surrounded in, other creatures that we're surrounded in, and showing respect to that. I think that really helps with the connection of human to the planet. And through that, then we can connect to ourselves,
mm.
and then we can connect to other humans as humans and accept that they're going to have nuances and body fluids and all these things that come with being a part of nature.
Yeah. Oh, that yeah, so much to unpack. But no, I love that you're talking about, are we more machine or are we more like, a part of nature? Um, there's so much resistance, as you said, to being like to having human nature. There's so much resistance to having a panic attack in public or to crying or, even things like passing gas, which obviously isn't ideal in a public setting, but it's so frowned upon. And I feel like there's so much restriction on us that we aren't noticing consciously, but we're feeling. Um, and for me, I think that contributes to the anxiety crisis is that there's so much that we're sort of trying to hold in all the time and so much that we're trying to keep repressed, and it's going to come out at some point eventually. uh
It's definitely
so
true.
yeah, yeah, so connecting to nature, I think, is a beautiful way of connecting to our roots for somebody who I guess for just your everyday person, like what's the best way to do that? Would you say like daily walks is probably the best bet, or like how can we just remind ourselves that we are a part of this world when so much is sort of designed to make us forget that?
Yes. I think, that's another thing that there's also this like the realistic what's realistic and doable. So for
Mm,
people, especially who live in urban settings, or for
mm,
people who have really packed schedules, or people who work from home in front of the computer, it might not necessarily be possible to go out and really feel in nature, right?
mm,
But nature, in many ways, is everywhere. So, for instance, one of the exercises that I have in, I think it's in Rewrite. I think
yep.
it's in the first one. Um, is like this mindfulness exercise that is has to do with just an orange.
Mhm,
So you don't really have to go out. Oh, of course, we all would love to go out on a daily walk, or it would be beneficial to go out on a beach or something, but it's not, as I said, possible. But if, with an orange, for instance, you could just really zoom in into that orange. You can, the textures, the smells, the taste, the membrane. Like there's so many facets of that orange. And it's actually a very fascinating experience to just like really zoom in into the all the qualities and textures and everything that an orange has. So, and of course, this can be done with anything. This can be done with a candle. This can be done with any other fruit, or this can be done right in front of your building, like with the bushes, right? Like you could just focus on that little bit of a green or a plant in your home. I think it doesn't, when we have these ideas of what it means to be immersed in nature, we think, throwing a tent and going camping and fishing and all these things,
mm,
which is grand, but we could really make it actually smaller, and that would still have an impact,
mm,
um, if we're able to connect, and if we're able to allow ourselves to really, mindfully go deep into that experience. So it could be in different sizes, but yeah, I think definitely having that idea of I'm a part of nature, and nature is so fascinating,
mm,
actually. Like you focus on any little part of nature, everything is so well thought out. It's just so fascinating. And allowing ourselves to just experience that awe
mm,
is all that we need. And we can do that in a beautiful, beautiful part of the world on a beach, but we can also do that in our kitchen with a orange.
mhm. Thank you. That's super accessible. Um, and it made me think about how, we often talk about nature and, like an orange, we would say like those are the simple things in life. But actually when you zoom in, it's like those are the most intricate, fascinating, intelligent things. Like
Yes,
maybe the
that's
machines
true.
are more of the simple things.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's like even like if you think about the human body, there's really
Oh.
not anything that's unnecessary, right?
Mm,
Like, and that's, I think, a big part of my work. Whenever I work with people and they're like, oh, I don't want to feel this and I don't want to have this, and but none of it is unnecessary, actually, right? Even our anxiety is there for a reason.
mm,
Our tears are there for a reason. Uh, our heart rate goes up for a reason. Like we are designed in such an intricate way that everything that in the design is has an evolutionary purpose.
mm. Yeah. I that in itself, I think, is a really healing thought. Because yeah, as I said before, there's so much of wanting to not be in your body with anxiety and panic, and just really having that sense of respect and awe for the way you're built and the things that your body does that you usually, you know, frown upon is really soothing. I love that. Um, I wanted to ask you about the next generation, being a parent yourself. I'm sure you deal with those challenges of bringing up the new generation of kids and adults, and how can we best support them in growing up in this world? How can we make sure that they're best placed to approach the world from a perspective of wholeness and humanness and all of those things we've spoken about.
Yeah, I actually have a lot of respect for the new generation. And I have a lot of privilege, I guess, of knowing them because I work with a lot of Gen Zers. And my son, he's almost 13 now. So I have a lot of access, I guess, um, to just hearing the way that they are seeing the world and speaking. And I think there's something very fascinating is that compared to other generations, Gen Zers are so much more aware of what's going on, and they're so much more compassionate
Mm,
about the world and the environment and other people's suffering. And social media, as many challenges as it has, makes it possible for them to be aware of other people's struggles in other parts of the world that they may not have access otherwise. And they're also so much more inclined in talking about mental health.
yeah.
And they are not just outspoken about their own mental health struggles, but they are also much more able than other generations to create space for other people who are suffering and show respect and kindness. And I think what we can do for those for the generation, first of all, we're leaving them with a world that has so many more challenges than the world we inherited.
Yeah.
And I think acknowledging that is very important. So there's an incredible amount of unrest, an incredible amount of economic inequality, and so many challenges that they are facing that we didn't face in our generation. And they are vocal about it. And I think what the older generation are, it's our responsibility to hear them. It's
Mm,
our responsibility to give them platform for them to be able to voice themselves and of course, in a systemic way, to have resources accessible for the younger generation, mental health resources, educational resources, so that they can excel because they're actually a very sensitive, very aware generation. And of as parents, it's our responsibility to be right behind them
mm,
and cheer them and offer support in whatever way that we can.
mm. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for being with me today. I love your approach. I think it's so beautiful. I wish that I had had that when I first started therapy. The nudge towards like movement and expression and all of that kind of thing. Um, I think it's so important that we talk more about that. And your new book, Confidently Chill, is out in the world. It is, as I said before, it's extremely comprehensive. Thank you for writing such a you know detailed perspective on anxiety and how we can kind of help ourselves through it. Um, you've also written Rewrite, which is about writing for expression and trauma. Is that correct?
Yes, it's a trauma workbook for expressive writing.
Beautiful. Okay. I'll link all those in the show notes. Um,
Thank you so much.
yeah, Duygu, I'm so grateful that you shared your time with us today. Um, and if I could ask you one more question, if you could distill, sort of everything that we've talked about today, what would be your advice to somebody who's really struggling with anxiety and panic and how can they best start to work through that?
In my personal and also professional perspective, as I mentioned several times throughout our talk, because I'm really a strong believer of this. We're human
Mm,
and we get injured in relationships and we also heal in relationships. And there's no shame in having difficulty or having anxiety or being depressed. And it's very important that we reach out to a safe person or reach out to a clinician because that's the only way we heal, through another person.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. I love that. Thank you so
Thank
much for
you.
being here. I will link all of your books and your website and everything in the show notes.
And thank you so much for doing what you're doing. Conversations like this are so important. So it's an honor to be a part of it. And thank you so much for the work you do.
Oh, thanks. It's a pleasure for me. I get free therapy out of it. Thank you for listening to the Us Anxious Folk podcast, the podcast for the chronically overwhelmed, perpetually panicked, anxious folk in all of us. If you would like to find more about me, you can find me on YouTube at Lauren Rose or on Instagram at Lauren R_Rose.